This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Right On, showcasing the work of Otago Southland writers. I'm Beverly Martens. Join me for news and interviews with local writers on the second Wednesday of every month from noon till 1 and replayed the following Sunday at 1 p.m. Right On is brought to you by the Otago Southland branch of the New Zealand Society of Authors and kindly supported by the great team at the University Bookshop.
What do you want to be when you grow up? They say you are what you read, and the University Bookshop can help you be whoever you want to be. Do you want to be an athlete? Then sit down with an inspiring sports biography. Do you fancy yourself as a detective? We have a grisly lineup of murder mysteries waiting just for you. Do you aspire to be the world's greatest chef? We have cookbooks to tantalise your taste buds. Do you want to celebrate your inner child? Play up in our fabulous children's room. The University Bookshop, helping you decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Hello and welcome to Right On, brought to you by the Otago Southland branch of the Society of Authors. And I'm your host, Beverly Martens. Wow, what a rich creative time it's been here in Otipoti, Dunedin of late. The sold-out New Zealand Poetry Day event at the library a couple of weeks ago, where there was jam-packed a crowd, just really enjoyed a whole range of collaborative poetry, music and dance combined with the celebratory 10th anniversary of the City of Literature status that Dunedin has. And then last Saturday, the New Zealand NZSA regional roadshow came to town with a variety of workshops on the specific craft of writing, which was sort of across various genres such as crime, poetry, memoir and historical fiction. And at this roadshow, I was lucky enough to catch up with historical acclaimed novelist Cristina Sanders and pin her down for an in-depth interview. And this is what I'm going to play for you now. Today I'm chatting with Cristina Sanders, an excellent New Zealand historical fiction writer, about her latest novel, Okiwi Brown. Now, I normally talk with local writers, and Cristina lives in the Hawke's Bay, and this novel is set in Port Nicholson in the sort of 1840s. But because it's an early colonial New Zealand story and the lives of early Irish and Scottish immigrants, I think it really resonates just as well with people here in Dunedin, because that's kind of our history too. Particularly slightly later down here in the 1860s after the gold rush, when sort of all and sundry were thrown together and expected to gel with kind of no supporting infrastructure. And so that's sort of what the setting of your novel, Cristina. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
And another reason I wanted to talk with Cristina, because she gave an excellent workshop at the NZSA Roadshow here in Dunedin at the Art Gallery on Saturday, which she called Taking the Past Out of the Archive. So that was a bit of a how-to on sort of how to write historical fiction. So really welcome and really great to talk to you, Cristina. If I can start with your latest novel, Okiwi Brown, can you kind of give listeners a quick summation of this incredible tale?
Thank you. Hello. Hello, listeners. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Had a lovely time in Dunedin last weekend. Cool city. Yes, Okiwi Brown, it's an historical fiction story of early Wellington, and I'm interested in the settlers who came here and why they came here and who was allowed in and who what, everybody was basically allowed in. But the interesting thing about Okiwi Brown is he was a real man who set up this rather nasty, evil pub over on the eastern bays of Wellington Harbour, Port Nicholson. And the more I learned about this character who was accused of a murder, the more I sort of drew the parallels with some suspicious gossip about his early years, and that he was somehow related to the Burke and Hare murders in Edinburgh. And some of your listeners actually probably have a lot of Scottish heritage people down there. So a lot of them say, oh, we know all about Burke and Hare. They were the notorious body snatcher murderers of the late 1820s, who would drag people off the street, get them drunk, suffocate them so there were no marks on the body, and sell them to the anatomists. And eventually they were caught, and Burke was very publicly hanged in Glasgow. In Edinburgh. But Hare turned King's evidence and they had to let him go. So they dropped him off on the road south of Dumfries and said, off you go over the border to England, and we never want to see you again. And as far as history is concerned, that's where he's lost, on that border. But there is a little town there called Annan, and I went to visit it last year. And it's a derelict port now, but in the day, at the end of the 1820s, there were ships going quite regularly down the coast to Liverpool, where the whalers would pull in, and the Norwegian whalers were going there, and they would pick up sailors there. And there are so many similarities, as well as the rumours, with this Irish, very violent innkeeper in Scotland and this Irish, very violent innkeeper in Wellington. And the 12 years sort of difference is about the time he might have been on a whaling ship and going around the country. There's rumours that he was in Australia for a bit, and he turns up in Wellington. Now, I don't know the truth of that, but it seems a pretty likely scenario to me. So we have this man turning up in Wellington, and he wanders around to a place called Okiwi Bay, which is where Eastbourne is now, or it's called Rona Bay now. And he sets up this pub, and he lives a rather degenerate, horrible life there. He picks up a woman who's discarded on his beach by whalers. And the rumor is, well, they don't really know who she is, but I think that she was a Moriori woman who was sold or given away to whalers from the Chatham Islands after the Ngāti Mutanga went there. And so she was probably a slave for a while and then part of the whaling community. And then she ended up with Okiwi Brown. And the pair of them lived there for years. And then there was this murder trial because it was a murder that happened on his beach. That's kind of the outline of the story.
It is, yeah. No, that's a brilliant outline. Thanks, Cristina. So there's a couple of things out of that I just wanted to kind of expand on. How did you get a fresh take on the well-documented sort of Burke and Hare murders? Because there's a lot of information around those, isn't there? So how did you kind of take that and weave it into your tale? That's one question. And I guess the other question is that the story is quite unresolved because we don't know. So what were the challenges of writing that?
Okay, one of the main interests I have in history is going back to source material. And I try to avoid everything that's been written since until I have a good feel of the story myself. So I went to I didn't read a lot about Burke and Hare that's been written over the last century. And I tried to go back to original data. And I actually went to the British Library in London and spent a couple of rather horrible days reading through their confessions. Both Burke and Hare made quite detailed confessions. And after that, I looked at people's analysis of those and what they thought from a modern perspective. And I ignored all that. I went back and I just took the confessions and wrote from those. So it wasn't a new perspective, but it was my perspective. So I haven't tried not to be influenced by other people bringing in other murders. Oh, it was like Jack the Ripper and this sort of thing. No, I just stuck to the actual testimonies from the men themselves.
But that made it more personal because of that, didn't it, really?
It was pretty horrible. I mean, it wasn't very pleasant being in their heads for a period of time. Sorry, what was the other half of the question?
Oh, just about the fact that it's an unresolved story.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is an unresolved story. And I think a lot of history is unresolved. I talked about that in my workshop on Saturday, the fact that people get history and there's this sort of continuum between how people write history and the amount of facts they put in, the amount of analysis they do and interpretation. And there's right at the other end, you've got Game of Thrones, where people have got talking walls and things. But in between that is sort of this big grey area where historical fiction lives. And it is unresolved. So like all my stories are unresolved. I mean, the story of Mrs Jewell and the wreck of the General Grant was also another unresolved story. So what I quite like to do is trying to put myself back in the shoes of the protagonist and think, what really would have happened here? What might have happened? And because we don't know, I fill in the gaps with a likely scenario, which makes it absolute fiction, of course, but it makes it something that could possibly have happened.
Yeah, but very grounded fiction, I think. Now,
Well, I hope.
yeah. Sorry, I was just going to ask you about Okiwi himself, because, he's unscrupulous, he's insecure, he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Maybe that's because of his past, maybe it's just because of his personality, and he takes it out both on Nan, his common law Māori wife, and his indentured worker, Matthew.
Yes.
Did you have any affection for Okiwi? Or maybe this...
Not at all.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me if I'd like to have lived back in those times, and in fact, no, absolutely not. He was a monster.
Was it hard to stay with him though because of that, or?
Well, I couldn't write from his perspective. I started off when I wrote the story thinking I would write Okiwi Brown and see some of the scenes through his eyes, perhaps use him and Nan, his common law wife, as the two protagonists. But I found I couldn't write Okiwi. He doesn't have redeeming features. He doesn't turn into a good man at the end.
No, he has no insight, does he? Yeah.
So you tend to want to have a character that goes from good to bad or goes from bad, but he didn't. And he was, I think he must have had, I don't know, they didn't have any psychology for it in those days, but he certainly had a screw or two loose. He was a very nasty, psychopathic piece of work. Right. And I did read quite a few books on the sort of psychiatric illnesses he might have had. And he was altogether a horrible man.
He was a survivor and an opportunist, though, wasn't he? He did what it took. It was sort of just deep cunning often, wasn't it?
I don't even know if it was deep cunning. It was just, I think his first murders, if it is true, if he is the same man with Burke in Scotland, were purely driven by a total lack of empathy and money. So they needed a quick way to earn a buck, and they thought you sell a body who's already dead. And then there's that little slippery slope, to taking a body who is going to be dead soon and sort of helping that along to murdering people on the streets.
That was all fascinating. Yeah. So, sort of, I wondered if your earlier novel, Jerningham, which is set sort of 1840s as well, in a similar the sort of Port Nicholson locale, not all of it, but a lot of it. And for listeners who don't know, Jerningham is about the black sheep, shall we say, in the esteemed Wakefield family. So he's the one that's sort of on the out. He's a bit of almost a remittance man, isn't he? He's sort of sent.
I think esteemed is very kind.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, well, in terms of the Wakefields overall, but they were significant. Shall we call them significant? But did you sort of had a lot of that research and ambience? Is that true for this novel?
Yes. Yeah, I found that was a really good background. I wrote Jerningham as part of my postgraduate diploma in creative writing. So I was working at Whitireia under the guidance of Mandy Hager at the time. And I just spent that whole year absolutely thoroughly engrossed in learning how to write a story, but also learning the history. So I did far, far, far more research than was necessary or possible. Really, I just engrossed myself in it. But I did take notes very carefully because I was doing it for a project. And so I have a very detailed timelines and stories behind it, all the stuff I didn't use in Jerningham. But it did throw me into the era. And the reason I wrote Jerningham was because I wasn't very historically grounded in my own town. I mean, Wellington, I grew up in Wellington, and I wanted to learn all I could about those early days. So although that was the first, that was almost a decade before Okiwi was doing his horrible things, it did set the scene for what the feeling was in Wellington, and the fact that these people had been bought over really by the New Zealand company, sometimes rather unscrupulously, and they were rather left. So the workers I've got, it's true, they were just sort of abandoned by the New Zealand company because there wasn't enough work for them, and there wasn't any real wraparound support for them. So yeah, a lot of what I learned from Jerningham was in the back of my mind. And it was interesting to go on because I finished Jerningham, but it ends with the Wairau affair and sort of the mid 1840s. So it was quite nice to take that on and learn a bit more about the next
chapter, if you like. Yeah.
But it's not a sequel by any means, but it is yes, and time. It's the next chapter in Jerningham's story, I suppose.
Yeah, I think some of the sort of jeopardy of the times carries over, though, doesn't it? You know, because you realise that, you know, you've got sort of a main character, Lecky, and his young daughter, and, you know, and even the soldiers that are there at the time, you'd think they'd have a more secure sort of lifestyle, but it's not. You know, it's temporary, it's dangerous. You get fired on a whim, you get hired on a whim.
Yeah, they were hard times. So they were. I mean, history, people look back with golden sort of, rose-tinted glasses at history, but it was a horrible time.
Now, I love your writing style. I've really enjoyed it in all your books because I find it unvarnished but authentic and quite prosaic. So I'm just going to read just a tiny extract just so listeners get a flavour. And this is back in Edinburgh, and it's describing the boarding house that William Hare and his wife Margaret run. William Hare and Margaret ran a lodging house in Tanner's Close, one of the dirtiest streets that ran to the city walls near the West Port, where falling tiles had killed a child more than once, and entertainment was primarily found in the misfortune of others. They offered 7 beds for travellers with space for 2 or 3 bodies in each, and Hare charged more than a reasonable rent for less than sanitary conditions. Now, that's just so straightforward, but I know there's...
It's like, isn't it?
Yeah, because it's just like, got it. You know, it's also very visual, but just that sort of droll comment about, you know, entertainment found in the misfortune of others. So that looks an effortless paragraph, but there must be so much research behind that. Do you want to just sort of talk a wee bit about that?
Yeah, I think I do get a bit silly with research because I like... looking at history through the senses. And I'm a geographer by education, so I've got a degree in geography, so I love maps. And I spent a lot of time looking at the old maps to find out where Tanner's Close was. And they talk about the port, but it wasn't a port as in a shipping port, it was a port as in the walls, you know, the port and the door and the walls, the French, you know, port.
Like a portal, yeah.
Like a portal, yeah, so it's a door on the walls, it's not a shipping port. That took me a while to work out. But if you go to Edinburgh now, you've got these little narrow alleyways, which are clean and lovely and historic now. But in the day, you can imagine how filthy they would have been. And horses and carts and filthy part of town. And you look at the way the slope goes and how a lot of the sewage would have run down the street and just run into the houses. And it was a pretty horrible place. But there were a few people have written about it. There were a few reports of it from the police reports when they went in. And there's a picture actually in one of the old books of what that house looked like. So I do like that kind of visual research. I like to think of, I mean, I have been there to Edinburgh to that part, and I like to think of walking in the places where the people walked. And the bit about the tile falling off the roof, killing children, I don't know if that actually happened, but I imagine it probably did. And that was a bit of imagination. But you can the smell and everything, I like to try to drag my readers down there with me. I mean, if I've got to suffer it, I'd like my readers to come along.
In talking of suffering, my favourite characters were the long-suffering stoic Nan, Okiwi's wife, in inverted commas, and young Mary, which is a sort of bright and lovely daughter of a sort of itinerant man called Lecky, who's one of your main sort of protagonists, who's just trying to, you know, his wife's died. The dream that he thought he was coming to in New Zealand has long since evaporated. He's got his own foibles. He's a bit of a drinker, so he's trying to. He's having this hard scrabble existence with a daughter in tow. But what I think you do superbly is insert strong female characters in such a sort of male-dominated world or a male-dominated history. And you certainly did that with Mrs Jewell and the wreck of the General Grant. Is that your thing, as it were, to bring women's stories to life? I
hope so. I think I am quite a strong feminist, and a lot of history is the good stories all go to the men. And I think if you want to write a story about a woman in history, you're either making up the whole thing or you're working with a sort of male adjacent character. And I've chosen to do that quite deliberately. I mean, in Jerningham, it was almost an entire male story, but I brought in an invented woman to explain sort of the female viewpoint on a few things. But this one, I really did want to have a a different viewpoint, and putting together those characters was actually quite deliberate. And the two women were very essential parts of that, to give those totally different viewpoints. And Nan particularly was a very hard, probably the most difficult character I've ever written, because I'm taking this jump and I'm assuming she was a woman from the Chatham Islands. And I'm assuming that she had very little memory because she'd had no one to talk to about her past and there was no connection there. So I'm taking some jumps here, and then I told it from her point of view, which is another big jump. But I did take advice on that and ran it past someone on the Chatham Islands Council to make sure that I'm not taking a story out of turn, and it could have been like I drew it. But she's a very difficult character because she is someone who's traumatized.
And she's stoic and largely silent too,
yes.
in her actions. You know, she's always in the background of things, and she might see them, but she won't say anything because she's in an abusive relationship. She's never going to kind of talk back to Okiwi. So that's another writing challenge, isn't it?
Well, at first I didn't put her in altogether, and the only female voice was Mary, and I gave a bit more. I tried to bring another female voice in, one of the wives of one of the other men, but I decided I did want Nan to tell the story, even though she was telling it from her own point of view, which was very suppressed and only limited to what she can see exactly in front of her and keeping herself safe. And she kept herself safe by being very quiet, sitting in the background, not having any agency in her life, just letting other people dictate her life for her. But I used that sort of result of trauma that she would have had to define her. And I hope in the end she comes out as being a strong character. I'd like to think she did, but it was a tricky one to write. Mary, on the other hand, was a joy to write, because I know a little girl just like I imagine Mary would have been, who's just positive about everything and about the same age. And so I kind of wrote my friend's character into that story. But she's a real woman, Mary Leckie, and I've met her descendants and talked to them.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and they gave me a lot of background to the family. So William Leckie and his daughter Mary. So that's all based on a real family.
And I did like, because essentially, you know, we were talking about how hardscrabble the lives of the main characters are, and there's, you know, sometimes there's situations that are bad and then they get worse. And then it's sort of wrapped up by the trial. But I did love the little kind of foreshadowing of what happened to Nan and Mary in their lives later. You know, that was, it was slightly redemptive, wasn't it? And that was
it was. Yeah. I wanted to, I mean, it's true. The ending of Nan. I won't go into detail in case people want to read it. I don't want to put a spoiler in, but that rather nasty ending with Nan, but actually turns out to be her pal. I think. Yeah.
I know. Loved it.
That's actually true, but that what happened is true. But I put my slant on why it happened. I think maybe it's true, maybe it's not. It's fiction, you know.
Now, just how you came into this realm, Cristina. You grew up in a bookshop, and by your own admission, you're obsessed with New Zealand colonial history now, and you love the sea. In fact, you part of the volunteer crew for the Spirit of New Zealand, which is the youth training sailing ship. Is it a bit chicken and egg? What came first? Did you love the sea and therefore love stories that? Because all your stories are sort of pretty much, you know, the sea's a sort of strong character in them, isn't there?
Well, apparently I didn't realize it till later, but every book's got somebody falling into the sea, which I hadn't realized, but there you go. So there must be something in my psyche about that. I've always liked the sea, paddling around on the coast and stuff, but I was never a sailor until I started writing Jerningham. I've been out in a couple of boats, but I'm not a sailor. And I wanted to know, this is part of this absurd research thing I have, I want to know what it felt like to be on a boat, on a tall ship at sea, and hear the waves and listen to the, you know, have the sun on the sails, and know why it took them so long to get out of a harbour, or what it meant to be windbound in a harbour, or what it meant when they were tacking and squaring. I didn't know what a squaring yard meant. So I did a trip on the Spirit of New Zealand, and
got hooked somehow.
My life changed. Yeah. They said, "Do you want to come back?" And I said, "Yes, please." And so now a lot of stories I get from the books in the Spirit Library, or from the sailors, or, you know, it's a lot of Mrs Jewell and the Wreck of the General Grant came out of that idea of being in this squashed place with all these people in the small area together and having to get on with everybody and the manipulations you do to make sure you do get on well with people.
And absolutely being like at the mercy of the weather. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing we tend to forget about, I think, when we look into history, the fact that we aren't defined by the weather anymore. I can't remember the last time I was soaking wet because I've been out in the rain. I would put a coat on or
take shelter.
Take shelter, yeah. But in those days, of course, they were absolutely, they'd have to build shelter before they could go into it, and it would fall down, it would blow down, the earthquake would wipe it out. It was, we were far more at the mercy of the elements then, and we tend not to think like that when we read history, I think. So I try to put it back in.
And just out of interest, how often do you crew on the boat?
I've had a few years where I've been rather obsessed, and I was going every couple of months. Wow. And they're 10-day trips. So I've done a couple of 100 days at sea on the boat, which is it's my happy place. I love it.
So let's switch now to just a few points that you made, really helpful, writer's craft points that you made at the workshop on Saturday, which, as I said, was called Taking the Past Out of the Archive. And that word "out" was seemed key to me, because there are always known facts, and I'm using facts in inverted commas here, out of historic documents, and sort of you sort of taught us to hold them up to the light before that you write them into your story.
Yeah, I think that taking the past out of the archive is a Hilary Mantel quote, and she says the point of historical fiction is to take the past out of the archive and put it in a body. And I love that idea. And to put something in a body means you have to be holding it and you have to be feeling it and living it. And you do that with historical fiction. That's the point of it, really. And I do like the idea of questioning source data, not necessarily question the fact that this person hit that person, but we have one story and it might not be the true story. So they might have hit them because they were angry, or because they misjudged something, or because someone else actually hit them and they did. You don't really know what you've seen or how you record it. So I do suggest that when people are looking at source data, and certainly I do it when I'm looking at source data, I always think, is there another explanation for this? And what might it have been? Did somebody mishear something? And often just putting yourself in another character helps bring things to life a bit. I often think of war stories from the context of a woman waiting at home. Just what these things mean on a bigger scale, or how a child might see something and misinterpret it, or how somebody who's a bit slow might see something opposed to someone who's got very, very good eyesight. And it's just things from history are shrouded in the past, and we don't really know what happened because we weren't there. But I like to sort of think around those things a bit.
And talking of source data, what is your sort of here in New Zealand writing and New Zealand's historical story? I mean, what's your best go-to resources? Just name a couple, maybe.
Papers pass for sure. I mean, that's just essential for me. And I often print out lots of papers and just read the classified ads and find out that Westphalia ham was expensive and people were bitching about the fact there was nowhere to park their horse on Willow Street. All these things that you get from the newspapers, and people's attitudes and names. I mean, I think Papers Pass is the most amazing resource. And I would recommend anybody who's writing historic fiction that's contained in Papers Pass, which is from 1839 to about 1970 or something. Just go and read the newspapers and you find out what people are thinking and feeling and what they're arguing about.
Yeah, and some of the things are perennial. It's always about offal in the harbour. And drunkenness. And I think in one of the things you gave us, I found it just the wording of a little ad for a hotel, and it said they wanted a smart waiter and a housemate. And I I'm probably putting the tone on that, but doesn't that just distinguish?
Yes.
Just the wording of that.
That wasn't for Okiwi's den, I can tell you that. Smart.
No, but do you know what I mean? That the smart waiter is out in front of the clients and everything, and the housemate is just an unseen person in the background.
Yes, and just the way they express things differently in ads than we do now. And that, so you get a good tone, but also you get little words and the expressions and the feeling of the age. So yeah, Papers Plus is definitely a great bit of data. And it's immediate.
So how do you... So it's wonderful to do all this, and lots of writers will be guilty, though, of getting lost and bogged down in the research, because that can become a job in itself, and it can also lead to procrastination, I would think, for some for some writers. So how do you stop yourself getting overwhelmed? And I mean both personally, so that your head's sort of too full, and also within the final story that you write, that I've read some historic fiction where the author seems very intent on showing you that they did all that work. So how do you kind of counter those things?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it is important that you only put a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of the stuff that as a pointing out this is a bit of history. I think if you read enough of it and get absorbed enough into it, it does fade into the background, and you just explain things as they were, because this is what they see when they're walking down the street, and you're not trying to point them out. It just becomes part of the story. I think a lot of it is reading. I'm a huge reader of historical fiction, and I think a really good thing to get yourself into the times is to read historical fiction around your era. So I'll read all of Dickens before not all of Dickens, but I'll read huge chunks of Dickens before I'll start a new book, just to sort of get the feeling. And then it doesn't become the sort of laborious thing of trying to fit a historical fact in, but it's just writing. Sort of
grassroots, really, isn't it? It's right down and in and on the street.
Yeah, and I don't think you can do too much research. I like getting bogged down. I'll chase every single rabbit hole that's there because I enjoy it, But the thing is, I've got the time. I don't know many other full-time writers out there. I'm full-time. This is what I do. And I have got lots of time to read and to absorb all this stuff. And the unfortunate thing is in New Zealand, not many people have that luxury until you sort of leave your day job and can write full-time. But not many of our young writers particularly have got that luxury of being able to spend time really researching and going to the places. And I mean, who goes and joins a ship just so you can get a bit of experience? It's you can only because I've got the time,
right. And the interest, though,
and the interest. Yeah, you've got to have the time and interest. And I mean, some people manage to. I'm always amazed at these people like Eileen Merriman, who's juggling being a full-time doctor and writing these books with the young family, and Catherine Chidgey. They do. I don't know if I could do that. But if you've got, the young writers who have got young families and full-time jobs and things, they don't have time to do all this research. And I think it is important. So I'm lucky, I guess.
And also in the workshop, you also just handed out a couple of things which I think was extremely useful for people, that if you are doing that research, that the importance of creating a timeline. I mean, you had one with, you gave us the example of the one with Jerningham. Now, I haven't counted it up, but there must be, over 100 points, but they are dates and what was happening in the wider world, so that then you're not going to make those mistakes of someone boarding a ship that actually hadn't arrived in New Zealand yet, that kind of thing. I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but...
Yeah, I think that's very important. For me, that's very important to get those dates right, and especially for that sort of era. A lot of New Zealanders are very proud that their ancestors came in on those first ships. And I like people coming up to me and saying, I had somebody who came in the Martha Ridgeway, and I know when that arrived, and I know where it came from. And that was quite important to me, to get those sort of important dates that might be important to other people, to get them right, get the names right, to know who else was on the ship. So I've got all of those records.
So that's about respecting your readers, in effect.
Yeah, respecting the readers and respecting the history. But everyone has, people are writing different types of fiction, and my fiction is, I think, grounded. Some facts I won't fudge. So timelines I try to get right. People's names I'll get right if I can. When somebody was let go from the army, I'll make sure I get that date right. So all of those things are important because we don't have a very big history in New Zealand. So I think we can respect what we do have and get that right. Mm. And so, I do those. I mean, that timeline's now it's over 2,000 entries because of all the other books about the same time. But it's just a really useful resource because you can go back and, if you do want to know when the Firefly came into Wellington Harbour, you've got that in a date. So if I'm looking at another book that was set in 1846, I just have to look at 1846. I think, the Firefly came in, so I can add that in. So it's a really useful resource. And it's all linked to my bibliography. So if I do say that, I can go and find out what book that came from.
Right.
So, and if you're going to write, especially if you're going to write a lot of books in the same era, I don't know why you wouldn't have a really detailed timeline like that.
So helps you claim the space. Something I noticed you don't do, though, which I really didn't notice in actually reading Okiwi Brown, but you mentioned it on Saturday, was that you don't labour the point with dialects and the way that people speak. Yet I could distinguish all the characters, but when I thought about it later, when, they did use the odd, shall we say, modern swear word, but, I knew who was who, but it wasn't like they were talking in the, the Irish lilt or the Scottish dialect or, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it depends. This is a judgment that every historical fiction writer has to make. And I've made the choice quite early on to translate my stories for a modern reader. So I'm a modern reader and I'm writing a modern story for a modern person. I'm writing a story for a modern person. So I'm talking to you in my story because I'm explaining what happened and how it went. And I'm that this is the background to the story that doesn't need, I can tell you that in my language. But in dialogue, I will put a nod to, I'll give the Irish people the odd, Irishism, and the Scottish people might say, they'll have the odd Scottishism, but I don't and it's not a movie, and if that I can't put an accent into writing, and I think that is hard to read. And what I want is to portray the feeling and the intention behind the words. And I think that's easier to do translated as if they were modern people talking to each other. So, I mean, if you were writing a book from in medieval times, you wouldn't be using medieval English. You'd be translating that. Not so drastic, of course, but it's the same idea. I'd translate things into the modern vernacular because if someone stubs their toe, egads sounds a bit stupid nowadays, and you'd want to give them something slightly more powerful, which I won't say on radio, but something that modern people can understand. So it's sort of telling the story for a modern reader.
See, and I think it clearly really works because I think it's a great read, but it's kind of an easy read because I wasn't tripping over those sorts of little things. It wasn't slowing the story down by thinking, what did they just say? So, yeah, I think it worked really well, and I thought it just made me think about it, that, I don't think I would have necessarily particularly noticed if you hadn't brought that up, Yeah,
I think a lot of people do it differently. A lot of people like to put in the dialect, and some people do it. Charlotte Randall was someone who does it absolutely brilliantly when she brings in, I think, Hokitika Beach, when she brought in this boy learning Te Reo, learning English, and she does that in her stories, and it's as soon as you get in the swing of it, it's fantastic.
Right.
But I don't know that I'm a good enough linguist to be able to carry that off. I can't do accents when I'm speaking, so I don't think I would do that very successfully. But yeah, it's about the feeling of the story as opposed to getting the language absolutely correct. Because I mean, I'm not pretending to be a Victorian woman. If I was pretending to be a Victorian woman, I would write in her style. But I'm not pretending the books from Victorian times.
And that was another thing that came up on Saturday, is not, it's really working hard not to bring in our 21st century kind of sensibilities and social mores and insights and psychology back into times where none of that existed.
That's why I like, when you're at the workshop, that's why I like doing this thing where you have to write down events before and after. And so when you're in your place, you find your place, I'm 1860s or 1920s, wherever I am, these things didn't exist. And you have to just drop them. So as soon as you want to go in and talk about environmentalism, about somebody looking at the river and thinking, oh my goodness, we're eating all the fish in the river, environmental, burn down the trees, make some pasture, sure. Without anybody saying, oh, this is the wrong thing to do, because that voice wasn't even in their heads yet. So I think and it hurts sometimes in the way they express things, the way they looked at Indigenous people, the way the men looked at the women. It makes them horrible people now to our eyes. But I'm pretty sure if we went back and talked to our grandparents in their heyday, they would have had pretty obnoxious views to our point of view now. And yet we still love them. It's this idea of having somebody that can be not understanding the way we see the world now and not having those sort of the development we've got is because they were from a different age.
And every age has its challenges anyway. I mean, people will look back at us and question some of our, thinking, morals, choices, and we consider that we're, highly enlightened. So, yeah. Look, I could, speaking of enlightening, I found your workshop enlightening, entertaining, and also really pragmatic from sort of how-to professional development perspective. So thanks so much, Cristina. I really... I got a lot out of the workshop, and I really enjoyed reading Okiwi Brown, which is published by Cuba Press and available now at all good bookstores, including UBS here in Dunedin. Because even though I'm not writing historical fiction, I'm trying to do some memoir work at the moment back in the late 70s. And I found much of what you said, both, sort of really helpful for that too, because I think you work out which lens you're looking at things through.
I hate to tell you, but I think 1970s is considered historical fiction now, which is kind of frightening.
I was enjoying talking to you until that point. Look, great to chat. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and energy, and all the best with the next project.
Thank you very much.
Wasn't that great? And just a footnote, if you want to Google Cristina and check out either her books or her website, Cristina is spelt Cristina, so there's no H in her first name, so that's Cristina Sanders. Now, since it's spring and the daffs and the rodos are out all over town, let's play an Anthony Tonnen track called Daffodils and a Cash Book. And straight after that, I'll give you a heads up about some upcoming fantastic events that will be of interest to particularly emerging writers. Welcome back. You're listening to Write On with Beverly Martens. Now, before I sign off, I want to remind listeners about some upcoming opportunities. The first is the New Zealand Young Writers Festival, which is right here in Otipoti this coming weekend. Now, it's across 3 days, and I want you to think of it as like a fringe festival for words. There's a myriad of performances, poetry, panels, and all with a youth vibe in 6 inner city venues, and they're all free to attend. So get amongst it, whatever your age. Now, the other couple of events I want to talk about are not limited to Dunedin, they're nationwide. So the first is the Sunday Star Times short story competition, which has both a youth and an open category, and there's a total prize pool of, are you ready, $20,000. And the second is the University Bookshop Summer Writer in Residence. It's a 6-week residency and it comes with a stipend and accommodation at the Robert Lord Cottage, and that is particularly open to emerging writers. So just check out these kinds of opportunities because they are brilliant for profile and to move your writing career along. And both of those opportunities close early next month, so you've still got some time to check them out and apply if you think it's something for you. And speaking of UBS, we need to wish them a very happy 80th birthday, which they themselves are celebrating with general discounts on different books on different weekends throughout this whole month. And then as a final flourish, they're having a high tea at the bookshop on Sunday the 6th of October at 2:30 p.m. All people are welcome. There's no need to RSVP. You can rock up, and yes, there will be cake. So that's my show. Please keep reading, please keep writing, and I look forward to talking to you again next month when I hope to bring you an in-depth interview with multi-award winning writer Tracy Slaughter. So she was also down here for the roadshow, and I managed to nab an interview with her as well. So talk to you then, and goodbye for now.
What do you want to be when you grow up? They say you are what you read, and the university bookshop can help you be whoever you want to be. Do you want to be an athlete? Then sit down with an inspiring sports biography. Do you fancy yourself as a detective? We have a grisly lineup of murder mysteries waiting just for you. Do you aspire to be the world's greatest chef? We have cookbooks to tantalise your taste buds. Do you want to celebrate your inner child? Play up in our fabulous children's room. The University Bookshop, helping you decide what you want to be when you grow up.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.